What are the best ways of succeeding at importing products from China and avoiding failure? So the first key point is really down to your choice of supplier and who you're choosing to work with as a supplier. So regardless as to whether you go with a factory, a trading company, or a sourcing agent, you need to make sure that you've done thorough due diligence, right? That you've done your background checks on your supplier. This is where it all begins. If you haven't done that, you've basically thrown your business out the window from the start, okay? So it's really essential that you do your due diligence. Again, as I've said in previous videos, due diligence is a very big topic and it's something that I definitely will cover at some point. But that is where it begins if you want to be successful. The next step is ensuring that you have all the correct documents and contracts signed off. These contracts include your purchase order, any trade agreements, any MOUs, any NNNs. All those documents need to be in English and in Chinese for them to be enforceable in China should you wish to execute your rights on them. So in those documents, make sure you've included everything related to quality control checks. Make sure you've included things related to penalty clauses for delays and so on and so forth. Again, contracts and the documents, another big topic, but this is just to give you a very rough idea of what's required to be successful when you're actually importing. The next step is adequate planning. So in terms of timeframes, are you considering that Chinese New Year is actually coming up in 25th of January 2020, I think is the next Chinese New Year. And most factories will be shutting down for a month. So have you planned adequately in advance for the stock that you require? Usually a factory takes anywhere between 25 to 45 days, depending on the nature of the product, to produce it. So you need to make sure that you've got adequate planning there so that you take into account big long breaks, month-long breaks like Chinese New Year. There are constant national holidays happening in China, so make sure that you're planning around those, okay? That's a really critical point. Because if you haven't placed your orders, for example, by the end of November, early December, most likely you're not getting your container out of China. In fact, you'll probably find that most suppliers will stop taking orders at some point in early December, just because they know that Chinese New Year is coming up and everybody wants to get their goods out of China because they know that they won't be able to reorder until Feb or March, whenever they get back to work. So make sure that you plan around their national holidays. Another huge topic to think about is country of origin markings. So various products, depending on the countries that you're importing into, need to have made in China clearly printed on them. Now that doesn't apply to every single category of products. For example, health supplements, you can actually get away with writing carefully manufactured for XYZ company in certain countries. Again, I can't speak for the whole world. I can just say that certain countries, certain products don't require the made in China. However, in most circumstances, you probably will need to be writing made in China, either on the product itself or on the outer packaging, or both. Okay, so this is something that you need to check both with your customs at the port and with your freight forwarder, who will be able to give you more adequate information depending on which countries you're importing into, depending on the nature of the product that you're importing. Another thing is HS codes, HTS codes, whatever you want to call them. These are basically the codes that apply to physical products when they're being imported to a country. So as you know, at the moment, there's a bit of a trade war going on between America and China, and tariffs are constantly being increased, decreased, adjusted, and you really need to make sure that you're well aware of what your current HS code is for whatever product category that you're importing. Now, again, this is something that your freight forwarder should be able to advise you on. You can ask your factory what the HS code is for it, but I wouldn't rely on simply asking your factory. I would also make sure that you are speaking to your freight forwarder or speaking to various freight forwarders. Just cover yourself as much as possible to make sure that you get the HS code correctly, and to make sure that there are no anti-dumping laws that apply to your product, because God forbid any anti-dumping laws could lead up to something like 117% worth of tax on your product. I know this is something that happens more often in the US than elsewhere in the EU perhaps, but it's definitely make sure that you are on top of your HS codes and that you know what specific HS code applies to your product and what tax implication that's going to have on your product. So another thing is having adequate insurance on your goods, okay? So a lot of people overlook insurance when they're importing goods. If you're importing goods by sea or by air or by land or by train or however you choose to import your goods, make sure that you take out some kind of cargo insurance. God forbid, and this actually happened to a friend of mine not too long ago, freighter that was carrying his container actually was caught up in a typhoon, and basically a lot of the containers got tipped off the ship, and unfortunately for him, he didn't have adequate insurance and ended up losing $20,000-$30,000 worth of goods as a result of not taking out that insurance. Cargo insurance is not expensive. Depending on the value of your cargo, depending on what it is that you're importing, make sure that you take out the adequate insurance. There are lots of brokers that can handle that for you, but do make sure that it is something that you're taking into consideration to improve your chances of success. Again, on the topic of insurance, have you considered what trade terms you're using with your factory, whether that's Ex Works or whether you're going FOB or whether it's DDP or any one of the other Incoterms? Because if you're working on an FOB basis, have you thought about whether the goods are actually covered between the factory and the port? So this is something that you need to be considering the whole time. Think about your goods. What happens if there's a typhoon in mainland China? I was caught up in one last year actually. There was a very heavy one in the south of China in Shenzhen and Guangzhou. And a lot of container trucks were getting capsized between the factory and the ports. And your goods might get damaged as a result, and if you didn't have the adequate insurance, you'd have probably lost out on a lot of money. The next thing I want to go into is having the correct certifications for your products. I cannot emphasize this enough. It doesn't matter what product category you're in or where you're importing into, always make sure and do not rely on the factory to tell you that the product is adequately certified. It is your responsibility as the importer to make sure that your goods are adequately certified, whether that's FDA, whether that's CE, whether that's UL, ROHS, FCC, REACH, whichever type of certificates, depending on the product category or niche that you're in. Always make sure that you have the adequate certificates in place and that you keep adequate records, okay? Because if your goods arrive at the port, and this is something else that happened a few years back around 2012, a very good friend of mine imported 4 container loads, okay? I want you to think about that, 4 40-foot container loads of hoverboards. This is when hoverboards were really trending, right? So in his head, he was importing them for the Christmas period and he was gonna make an absolute killing on them. I think the total value of the stock was something like $120,000, give or take. When the goods arrived at Felixstowe Port here in the UK, the border control seized it, called trading standards. They pulled one of the hoverboards. They checked the battery. They checked the lithium battery that was inside the hoverboard, and they found that it wasn't compliant. They found that he didn't have the correct certificates. All 4 containers were seized. He had no choice to send those products back to China. So literally 120K went down the drain simply because he did not have the correct certificates and probably didn't carry out the correct quality control inspections when the goods were leaving from China. So again, as the importer, it is your responsibility, not the factory's responsibility, to make sure that you have adequate certificates to cover your products. On the topic of certifications, IP law, okay, this is a huge one. So a lot of people ask the factory, do you own the IP for this product, or is this product patented? And the factory might, well, it's the factory's interest to just sell you the goods, right? So they'll tell you whatever story it is just to make sure that they can get the sale, right? That's their predominant interest. Whether you end up with some kind of trademark infringement lawsuit in your home country, for them is regardless, right? most of the time anyways. So for example, if we're talking about stuff like pop sockets, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with them, but they're the little things that plug onto the back of your phone. So those guys have a patent on that, and it's a very, very hot selling product. However, that company rigorously enforces their IP rights and will take down your listings on Amazon, will take down your listings on eBay, on any third-party platforms, and also send you a cease and desist on your own website. So if something is patented, or if you're uncertain about it, do the IP checks, because sometimes a product looks too good to be true. I'll give you another quick example. There was a hairbrush called the Tangle Teaser, right? This is something which is quite famous in the UK, and I think they've now gone global. Again, they had some kind of design right registration, if not a patent, on the actual product. It looks like a normal hairbrush. However, because of the shape, because of the way the bottom part clips into the hairbrush, that product is patented. If you went looking on Amazon using Jungle Scout or Helium 10 or whatever research tools you're using, and you saw that that product was selling 30, 40, 50,000 pounds worth of product every month, you would be thinking, wow, this is a killer product. You'd go onto Alibaba, type in Tangle Teaser, you'd find the brush being sold for 75 cents or $1.50 or whatever prices you might be able to find. However, had you imported those Tangle Teasers into the UK, put them up on Amazon, put them up on any third-party website, or even on your own website, you would have had a lawsuit faster than you can say lawsuit filed against you. So again, IP protection is your responsibility, not the factory's responsibility. They just want to sell you the stock, so make sure that you're covering yourself when it comes to IP rights. Another thing to think about is the size, weight, and dimensions of your product. Now, depending on what it is that you're importing, is there a more efficient way of packaging that product to reduce the volume? As I'm sure you know, if you've already imported products from China before, or if you haven't, this is definitely something to consider. The size and the volume of the goods are going to affect the shipping method that you're using and the cost of shipping. So for example, if the volume exceeds a certain amount, it might go from being less than a container load to being a full container load. And the threshold between LCL and FCL varies sometimes, and this is going off on a tangent with regards to shipping. Shipping I can cover another time. If you're going over, say, 6, 7 CBM, even if you're not filling out an entire 20-foot container, which can hold up to 28 cubic meters, it's sometimes better to leave a container 3/4 empty than it is to ship it less than a container load, because there are handling charges when the goods arrive at the port. So again, reducing the volume, thinking about the packaging, thinking about how you can reduce the volume as much as possible is something which is essential and something which will definitely have an impact on your profit margin, on your bottom line. So definitely keep that in mind when you're sourcing your products from the various manufacturers. Huge, this is massive. Quality control inspections. So many people disregard the importance of quality control. Every single time, I don't care if you've been working with a supplier for the last 10 years and you have the best relationship with them in the world, and they've traveled over to your home country and you've hosted them and you've built up an incredible relationship. When it comes to business, when it comes to sourcing products from a factory in China, quality should be your utmost consideration. This is one of the key things that you need to be focusing on, okay? So make sure that every single time that you're exporting a product from a factory, that you're doing a quality control inspection, or several as it happens. Personally, we take quality very, very seriously. In fact, some manufacturers have refused to work with us on the basis of the extent to which we insist on quality. So in certain cases, even for a 20-foot container, now I know that this industry standard is something like AQL 2.5. Most people will take an average of about 20 to 30% of goods to be checked and kind of hope that everything else is fine. For us, we actually had our own in-house quality control inspection team. However, even if I was outsourcing this to another company, I would insist on having at least 50%. We personally used to inspect 100% of the goods. Again, that's down to the nature of the goods that you're importing. If you're importing 10 container loads, okay, fine. That might be slightly unreasonable to expect 100% inspections, but quality inspections are a must. They should be included as part of your contract, and they definitely need to be conducted according to the nature of the product that you're importing. So make sure that every time you import a product, I don't care how many times you've worked with the manufacturer, whether it's the first time or the 100th time, always be carrying out quality control inspections, because all it takes is for one bad batch of goods to slip out of that factory and get your Amazon account shut down because you're getting too many returns, too many defects, too many low quality ratings. It can damage your entire brand reputation essentially. So you want to make sure that you're always keeping quality control at the forefront. So the next thing is with regards to payments. So always make sure, again, and this is part of the due diligence process, that you are paying the bank that corresponds to the company name that you have signed off your contracts with, okay? Don't ever fall for the trap where a company is telling you that you can simply wire the money to their account in Hong Kong because they'll get more favorable exchange rates or whatever, and that company ends up being in a different name. Because if, God forbid again, should you end up having to pursue litigation against that company and your purchase order doesn't correspond to the company, none of your contracts correspond to the company that you've made a payment to, you're not covered. So make sure that all the payments are going to the name of the company that's obviously clearly written on whatever designated bank, whether it's a mainland China bank, whether it's a Hong Kong bank, but make sure that the actual company name corresponds to all the contracts, to your POs and every other document that you've signed, right? On the topic of payments, bank scams are a new thing, or relatively new anyway. In the last 5 years, it's something that's been happening more and more frequently. What will happen is people will be getting spoof emails from suppliers. So last minute, when you're ready to send over the balance of 70%, 80%, whatever it is you've negotiated past your deposit, you might get an email from your supplier saying, "Hi, just to let you know, our bank details have changed. Could you please wire it to the following?" Okay? And they will have spoofed the same email address as your supplier. This, unfortunately, is something which happens more and more often, and something that you really need to be aware of. So make sure that if you ever do get an email that seems slightly suspicious coming from your supplier with regards to payments, that you contact your supplier immediately and say, "I just want to confirm that it was you genuinely sending me this email, and I just want to, cross all the relevant boxes to make sure that I'm not getting trapped into a scam here." Because unfortunately, this does happen frequently, and if you're unfamiliar with it, then you might fall into that trap and you might end up losing a ton of money, and there is no recourse. Once you've wired money, it's very difficult to recall it back again. So make sure that you're aware of that. Again, on the topic of planning, adequate planning, make sure that you've got a good just-in-time system in place. Okay, now just-in-time refers to your inventory planning system. So do not ever put yourself in a scenario where you run out of stock, okay? Because if you're a physical products business, it may well be the case that you'll have running overheads, and you do not want to be out of stock whilst you've got those overheads constantly coming in. So make sure that you plan your inventory adequately. Make sure that you think ahead, taking these Chinese holidays that I've mentioned, for example, Chinese New Year, into consideration. Make sure you take things like the Canton Fair, which are coming up this month. So the Canton Fair starts in 13 days. So make sure that you're taking into account the fact that suppliers are going to be inundated with orders, and make sure that you're planning your inventory accordingly, okay? So as long as you've gone through all of this list and made sure that you've implemented every single thing I've just mentioned, you've just put yourself at a severe advantage compared to most novice importers, or people that may have been importing for a while but might not have been aware of these critical points.